You know, in the 70 years since they started building Disneyland, there sure have been a lot of changes. I've been around for a lot of them, but going back to the beginning, there are layers and layers of changes. Like, for example, notice in that early picture of the park, in the very earliest years, there wasn't even a monorail beam out here. And you basically had a big old street right in front of the main entrance for drop-offs and pickups, and then all of this behind me was a parking lot. Yes, sir, things may have evolved slowly and piece by piece, but what a dramatic difference that nearly 70 years can make on a place, huh? We're back at Disneyland, and today is kind of a weird one. Because to bring it back to 70 years of changes, if you know me at all, you know that's what I'm obsessed with. The Disneyland of the past. And for more than a decade now, I've been coming down to Disneyland and exploring the past, time traveling with all of you, looking back into the past and collecting these old photos like crazy, collecting hundreds, thousands of old pictures of Disneyland so we can talk about attractions that are no longer here, the Disneyland of the past, the then and now videos. I am constantly collecting them, collecting old film, looking through them, doing research on different projects, different ideas that I have coming up specifically. In fact, I must say, with the amount of changes happening at Disneyland all the time and how rapid they are, combined with the amount of time I spend looking through old footage and old film and old pictures of Disneyland, I sometimes find myself confused, like, wait a minute, where am I? Almost like I'm expecting to walk through the gate and then be in the Disneyland of the 1950s or 60s or something like that. Almost like I'm becoming more familiar with the Disneyland of the past than the Disneyland of the present. And right now it's particularly acute because I have been working on some then and now videos, some videos about things from Disneyland's past. But no matter how familiar I get with Disneyland's past, no matter how much I think I know, every once in a while doing research, I come across something I have never seen or heard of before. Usually big things, you know, usually something where I'm like, how in the world did I not know about this? And I've got a whole list of them, and I'm sure I'll be sharing them relatively soon. But every once in a while, it's not even something big, it's something little and weird and unusual. And even though I'm preparing an episode about Disneyland's past, it's pretty involved. I'm going deep into my scarchives. I probably should be at home getting ready for that one when I came across a weird little unusual thing that I had never seen or heard of before last night. I knew I had to rush down here and scope out the spot for myself, which is why I am cruising back to the Alice in Wonderland ride. Hey, the Cheshire Cat's missing. That's weird. Now, this ride was a very early part of the park, and you could say it's been here since 1958. But just like all the other original 1950s dark rides in Fantasyland, Alice in Wonderland underwent a major overhaul. They basically tore down all the dark rides and rebuilt them in 1982 when they opened up this new Fantasyland. Because after all, Fantasyland used to look like this. Oh yeah, that was a big change. That's when they built Pinocchio over here. That's when they demolished the giant Chicken of the Sea pirate ship. They basically gutted the insides and outsides of all the dark rides, making them totally and completely different, which is a great subject for a future episode. But the unusual thing about at least the exterior of the Alice in Wonderland ride was, even though they rebuilt the whole inside, the outside remained more or less the same. I mean, you can see here in this clip that there were no teacups next door to Alice in Wonderland back then. You can see here we're at sort of the same angle, looking the same direction. They moved the old teacup attraction in front of Alice in Wonderland to make more space when they were creating new Fantasyland, and also it sort of creates a little miniature Alice in Wonderland land. I mean, you got the teacups with the Mad Hatter's little house, and then over here, the White Rabbit's house as part of the Mad Hatter hat shop. I mean, inside, they've even got his little bedroom all set up in there. Kind of created a cool themed area. Of course, those changes are all after 1983 when New Fantasyland opened. But the amazing thing is that even with all the changes to this area and the inside of Alice in Wonderland, it was almost completely different in the 50s. This exterior over here really looks almost identical to the way that it used to look back in the day. I mean, here it is back in the 1950s, and you can still see the giant colorful leaves. The Caterpillar ride vehicles are still pretty much the same. All this sort of giant foliage out here. I mean, the theme really did not change. If you were to come from the 1950s in a time machine to the present day, and you took a look at all of this, you would know right where you were. They even kept their old original mushroom ticket book over here as part of the attraction, despite the fact you no longer need separate tickets to ride on the ride. They just filled in the little hole where you'd pass them your little coupon to ride, and stuck it here in the garden. I mean, just look at Alice in Wonderland back in the day versus now. Sure, they moved the mushroom around, but the ride operator's still in basically the same place. The ride vehicles look virtually identical to the way they always have. One thing I didn't notice that was different, even looking at these photos last night, is that you could see right here, they had some giant, almost transparent looking leaves overhead for shade. Those are still kind of here in spirit in the form of these metal shade leaves over near the ride operators area. And as you'll see, all the plants and the giant plants have been rearranged. The track layout's slightly different here. Obviously, this gargantuan tree has grown up quite a lot in the last 20 or 30 years or so. But all that's sort of normal changes that I would expect. The change that really had me all shaken and not stirred, and it's sort of something weird and small that I never noticed before, is that instead of these sort of floral tulip lights growing up out of the plants in the front garden here, back in the day, if we look at these photos from Daveland, you'll notice they were actually dandelions. So they had not the dandelion flower, but you know when it goes into that stage where you pluck the thing and make a wish, look at those little balls up there, those globes. Now, this is not the thing that surprised me. It's something I hardly noticed, but I have seen before in the past, looking at old Disneyland photos. You can see Daveland's got a bunch of them, but it wasn't one of those photos. It was actually one of my photos in my collection I was looking at last night and going, what the heck is that? This is the photo in question, and at first all I was thinking was, oh, that's a perfect photo to show a kind of a then and now of how the plants have changed, and you gotta come pretty deep in the line to get to the spot where this photo was snapped. But I'm an old pro, I could wait 30 minutes and here we are. This is roughly the same spot, without the same camera and the same lens. It's a little difficult to match up. As you can see, the tree got a whole lot bigger. It totally dominates the scene now. The old big red leaf and foreground plants have completely changed. Gone are any sign of the old dandelion light. Look at that in the upper left-hand corner. There's a little piece of the Matterhorn showing, and it's early. Notice it's sort of orangey. It's hard to see that same rock outcropping today without getting closer because of this giant tree. But it's still here, right over there above the monorail track. I was looking at this, going back and forth, going, oh yeah, they moved around the plants, they changed them a lot, and oh yeah, those dandelions, those spiky dandelions. Wait a minute, what? Spiky dandelions? Look at those again. Look at those things. At first I was like, what the heck am I looking at? It looks like a virus. It looks like it's the COVID ride. I wasn't thinking dandelions. I go, oh yeah, okay, I get it. They're dandelions, the ones you blow on. But they're so perfectly mid-century. They look like little Sputniks up there, and I had never noticed those before. So I start looking through all my other photos, and from the air, even all the way back in 1958, whether it's my photos or Daveland's photos, I'm noticing that those little dandelion things are always perfectly round and smooth. I'm looking back at Daveland photos from 1958 when the ride opened. They're perfectly round and smooth. I started looking at pictures of the 60s and the 70s, always perfectly smooth. And that photo I have is definitely from the late 1950s, so maybe it was just really short-lived. Look at those strange, cool globes over those lights. I've never seen them before. I've never seen them in anybody else's photos. I've never seen them in promotional photos. I've never seen them in my old footage. I was really tripping out. So much so that even though it's a weird little kind of obscure thing, last night I was like, dude, I have got to head down to the park because I couldn't even remember if there were dandelions here for the main lighting at all. Like, are those little wish sticks still here? Am I remembering it wrong? And obviously, no, I wasn't. There are no more little dandelion wish things to blow on down here. It's sort of probably our #1 plant in Orange County. In everybody's lawn, we got those little blow on this and make a wish. My grandpa once told me, blow that in the street. We don't need any more of those growing on our lawn. I've also got to be the first to admit that even though I like the old little globe-like dandelions, the stained glass sort of tulip lighting that they have out here now is a lot more beautiful. I mean, these things are cool. I've been watching people go through the line as I was up going through it, trying to match up that photo, and people were all taking pictures of those like stained glass looking tulip lights. I mean, they're pretty awesome. And I never really realized how different they were than what was here in the 1950s. And I never in my life knew that they had spiky virus looking Sputnik ball dandelions over here in front of the attraction. I told you, it's weird, it's obscure, but this is the kind of stuff that gets me down here. Like, is it still there? what the heck? I mean, it makes sense because it matches the flowers in the film, and not just in the film, but in the attraction itself. As you're flowing around through the giant flower garden, you'll notice some of those kind of hanging down, droopy flowers. But nothing like those Sputnik dandelions. I know it's weird, and I know nobody cares but me, but that is obscure. That is awesome. That is a fun one. And of course, I did actually board a caterpillar and take a ride down the rabbit hole. And I can tell you one of the key differences between the old 1950s version of the ride and today's version is that back in the 1950s, much of the inside was a whole massive table scene where you were shrunk down Alice from her point of view, going through the tea table, like you were on top of the tea table. So all this stuff obviously is new and then upgraded in the last 10 years to have all these projections in the ride. They really plussed it up and made it a lot better, and you see Alice in the attraction itself. And then doing all this made me realize another thing I've never noticed before, which is that back in the 1950s, the original ride, that whole end section where you come down the ramp and you enter this little extra part of the castle, and they have the modern tea party scene with the white rabbit and the exploding cake, all of that was added in the 1980s when they changed and gutted the ride. So this is a whole add-on section to the exterior. Otherwise, you know, as you've seen with those two photos flashing back and forth, the exterior of the ride looks pretty much the same. I mean, you no longer have the old Skyway buckets going overhead, but all this castle stuff out here, this whole kind of backside of Fantasyland, all still more or less retains its 1950s shapes. With one major caveat, one major change did take place also in the last 10 years or so. Notice those Caterpillar ride vehicles high above the streets of Fantasyland. Well, back in this photo, from back in the 1950s, from the Skyway, you can see how narrow and winding that track is up above the streets here. And here's another photo of that winding, narrow track from, believe it or not, the top of the double-decker bus. Because side note, another very weird, very little-known Disneyland fact is the double-decker buses used to come all the way this way, past the hub, and all the way back basically towards this front part of the Matterhorn where you enter the line, kind of right here in front of Storybook Land, because the teacups weren't here yet. And they had this big sort of loop for the omnibus to turn around in. I didn't even know that until I was combing through old footage recently and saw footage of the buses back there. Like, what are they doing? So even I am learning new things all the time. Anyway, back to those photos. As you saw from those photos and from old video footage, you can see just how narrow and winding and twisty the track is. And although it's still pretty twisty even till today, about 10 years ago in 2014, they had refurbished and reopened Alice in Wonderland. And this whole sort of canopy up here on which the ride vehicles run was all replaced. So nowadays, that track is no longer very narrow. As you can see here from when I rode it today, it's pretty darn wide. And the reason is OSHA got to them. So not only is it wider so that if they have to evacuate the ride, guests can walk off of this thing more safely, but also the workers that have to come up here and clean it. You know, modern laws and rules and regulations took the scariness out of it quite a bit. In fact, as a kid, I rarely ever rode this ride because I didn't like that top portion. It was a little scary, a little dicey up there. But I guess if it's a cast member safety issue or an evacuating guest safety issue, it's probably for the best. Rats, we can never have anything fun. Here's another old fun pic where you can see that original thin track, and then if we zoom out a bit, obviously today it looks quite a bit different, but from this angle and the old photo, you can actually see the omnibus like I was talking about cruising back here to Fantasyland. Wild. You'll also notice they added a couple little turrets and things to the roof right here. Don't forget the old Skyway buckets used to come out of that big hole in the Matterhorn that's mostly covered up now. They used to go right over our heads directly through the area where this tree is now. And so over the years they plussed up the roof lines over there, especially when they did New Fantasyland, just to make it look a little more castle-y and a little less like, you know, the roof of a warehouse. Here's another old Skyway photo down at Alice. You can see just how thin and narrow that track was compared to the ride vehicles. It felt scary as a kid. It probably wouldn't feel scary to me now. Although you never know. I don't really like heights that much. And just for fun, here's one more old photo of this attraction and the sort of modern view of the same spot. You can see how much wider that twisty track got. It looks less twisty from the ground now. And of course, I love, look at those guys' faces. It's like someone went, Harold, look!
look, I want to take a fun pic.
Harold doesn't look too happy in that photo, does he? Looks like he might have ate a bad churro or something.
Ooh.
All right, and since we're out here, and since you are likely far less interested in some obscure old spiky balls compared to how interested I am, I'll show you another little secret of Alice in Wonderland most people miss. On top of the mushroom that used to be the old ticket booth, and you can see it in old photos and stuff like that, when it was still being used.
You can see just up on top there an abandoned set of shoes, and it's not just one pair of shoes, it's two different pairs of shoes. You can actually see it when you're up on that twisty track portion of the ride upstairs. That's actually because they used to have, for a while, a fiberglass caterpillar out here, like a character sitting on top of that mushroom when they reopened the ride in the 80s.
Sadly, it's too modern for me to have photos of it, so I can't pin down exactly when he was there, but it looks like someone didn't want him in the garden and flicked him out of his shoes or something.
Because he's definitely not on that mushroom anymore. Actually, there's 3 pairs of shoes up there. And speaking of being on mushrooms,
there have been rumors for years and years and years that Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland, might have been on some kind of mind-altering substance, or that the Disney animators were when they made this movie, because obviously the film is really trippy, just like the inside of the ride.
But thing is, Lewis Carroll was a pretty uptight Englishman with a background in like mathematics and logic and things like that. He was pretty darn straight-laced. So was Walt Disney.
Maybe it's one of those things where the more buttoned up and straight-laced you are, like in your day-to-day, the more you really appreciate really trippy, weird, creative stuff.
Because let's not forget, Walt Disney was about as Puritan as they come, and yet he was buddies with Salvador Dali.
Actually, the visual sort of trippiness of Alice in Wonderland when it came out, the film in 1951, very ahead of its time, because it was sort of modernist looking.
Actually led to the film being a box office bomb. It was considered to be a box office bomb in the 50s when it came out. I mean, it was super beatnik looking and modern and very colorful for 1951.
But no surprise here, when it was re-released in the 1970s, it was a big hit, because by then people appreciated, like, whoa, trippy, man, you know, all that kind of thing.
What's crazy is, even if it was considered a box office bomb in the early 1950s, by the time they built Disneyland, Disneyland got 2 Alice in Wonderland attractions. First, it had just the old school teacups, which were located kind of where the carousel is now, in the middle of Fantasyland, that old Fantasyland.
And then they went through all the trouble of adding this dark ride for that box office bomb film. Why? Because Walt Disney was a massive fan of Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland.
In fact, before there was Mickey Mouse, before there was even Oswald, there were the Alice comedies, so the early Walt Disney films featured a live-action Alice.
And the Wonderland itself was made up of animated cartoon characters. We're talking half a century before Roger Rabbit.
Even after Mickey Mouse came along, after Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and before Walt Disney made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, he was considering doing different full-length feature film versions of an Alice in Wonderland story, maybe featuring Mary Pickford as a live-action Alice.
From what I could tell, Walt seemed sort of hesitant to go back into Alice in Wonderland, but he was playing with the idea. Luckily, she had other plans, and so he worked on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs instead, which obviously worked out handsomely.
So it's crazy, because that small Midwestern farm boy growing up in Marceline, Missouri, who would read those Lewis Carroll books of trippy, weird, strange, a lot of puns,
and unusual characters and situations, but always keep that in mind. And then when he was operating out of Kansas City and doing his first animated stuff, Alice was involved. That's the first film that he kind of finished and released in LA. That led to Oswald, that led to Mickey, that led to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
All that success eventually led to Disneyland, and then he came full circle by adding his favorite, Alice in Wonderland, to his park, even though
it wasn't considered a successful film at the time, and it was pretty much dead by the time they put the dark ride in here in 1958. It had already been 7 years. Did people even remember?
It's crazy to think of now, because it's such an eternal classic. It's got its own fans. I mean, they have other attractions, the Labyrinth and stuff, and Disneyland Paris, so all over the world.
And then, like I said, in the 70s when they re-released it, it was huge for sort of obvious, you know, late 60s, early 70s reasons. It's just really strange that in 1951 it was so modernist, it was so ahead of the curve. You know, 10 years later, every cartoon looked like that.
But that sort of trippy, vivid color Mary Blair version of Alice in Wonderland, that is sort of the version I think of.
I'm an English literature guy. I like reading the classics more than I like films of like 99% of things. But when I think of Alice in Wonderland, the story, I think of Disney.
Because I mean, the real version, the book, is so kind of heady and strange, and then The Disney version is sort of compressed and colorful and fun.
I don't want to sound like an ignoramus, but I kind of prefer the Disney version a little bit. I don't know.
Anyway, there you go. I know it's sort of strange, weird, obscure, off the cuff, and people always ask me
how I know so much about weird, obscure Disneyland things, and the reason is I'm always doing research on the park, and you never know what's gonna take me way down the rabbit hole. Also, it's still weird that the Cheshire Cat is missing. Okay, I've been very distracted for the last month. I've been working on all kinds of boring stuff that were far too boring to talk about here and now. But like I said, I have been working on some very cool throwback time-traveling Disney episodes like this, but a little more in depth. I just thought I'd come down here and share the most random adventure in Disneyland of all time with you guys. It's a little bit weird, but that's what I'm here for. Make sure you're still subscribed. That's been happening a lot where people are like, what the heck? And you know all the other stuff. We've got merch at store.randomland.com. We've got a Patreon. I've got a daily kind of show on there every day. Well, more or less. And we've got podcasts. We've got all kinds of other things on there. About the parks, about Route 66, about all kinds of stuff. Movie commentary.
But you know what? Much like the White Rabbit, it's getting late out here.
So I think we've done our duty.
Time for us to go home and sleep well. I thought we weren't supposed to pet the wild squirrels of Disneyland. This cast member is the Squirrel Whisperer.
Squire the squirrel.
Squire the squirrel?
Squire the squirrel.
Ah, he's very well trained.
Well, of course. You know, he's trying to be a knight someday.
I thought he was nuts at first, but
well,
no.
He needs the nut. He needs the protein so that he can be a knight someday.
Oh, perfect.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, look at that.
There we go.
He's even got some light now.
Exactly.
Thank you.
It's so rare that you get a Sword in the Stone reference like that.
I'm still waiting for a Black Cauldron reference.